The Not-So-Fantastic Four have had a pretty rocky cinematic history, to say the least. The movie from the early 2000s wasn't exactly an Oscar winner, and the less said about Rise of the Silver Surfer, the better. But in August 2015, a movie was released that was so monumentally, overpoweringly terrible that it somehow formed its own singularity of shittiness, sucking in everything that had come before it and obliterating entire careers. I'm talking, of course, about Josh Trank's Fantastic Four, or Fantastic Four 2015, or Fant4stic. What the fuck? Anyway, Fantastic Four turned out to be one of the biggest box office bombs of the year, losing Fox over $100 million and winning no less than 5 Golden Raspberry Awards. A movie so bad that even Stan Lee refused to cameo in it.
Enough said.
Even worse, embarrassing revelations about studio mismanagement, clashing creative visions, directors melting down on set, and desperate reshoots gradually shed light on a nightmarishly chaotic production. So what the fuck actually happened with this thing? Well, let's find out together, shall we? Grab your spandex uniforms, because it's time for another episode of Production Hell. The seeds of Fantastic Four's failure were actually sown way back in 1986, when Constantine Films bought the film rights to the characters from Marvel, because it's not like they were ever going to make comic book movies, were they? Anyway, the project got kicked around for a few years without making much progress. Unfortunately, a problem was brewing. See, most film rights have a time limit built into them to prevent a studio sitting on them forever without actually doing anything. It's kind of a shit or get off the pot situation, and if Constantine didn't get some kind of Fantastic Four movie made soon, then the rights would revert back to Marvel. Their solution at the time was to cobble together a shitty, low-budget movie in the early 90s, which went through all the motions, but was never actually intended to be released. Damn, imagine being some enthusiastic young actor, thinking this movie's gonna be your big break, only to find out it was literally just a time waster to retain a contract. Anyway, by the early 2000s, the world had changed, comic book movies were making a comeback, and the race was on to snap up as many popular franchises as possible. In stepped Fox, who managed to get their hands on the X-Men universe and, more importantly, the Fantastic Four. They would go on to release their first Fantastic Four movie in 2005, which didn't get great reviews but still made a ton of money, so they were happy enough to greenlight a sequel a couple of years later. Unfortunately, it cost more and made less, and it was kinda shit, so the prospect of a third movie melted away, and nothing more was heard about Fantastic Four. However, it turns out that Marvel had been working on some ideas of their own during this time. After watching various studios trying and failing to adapt their comic books into movies, they eventually said, fuck it, we'll do it ourselves. And that's exactly what they did. Iron Man was the first in a string of box office hits, opening the door for Marvel's entire lineup to come into the fledgling MCU. Well, apart from the ones held by Fox, that is. Damn, they really must have regretted that deal from the 1980s. Relations between the two studios quickly deteriorated as the MCU gathered pace, to the point where Marvel Comics actually stopped promoting characters owned by Fox. But Fox weren't about to take that kind of shit lying down, so the following year, they announced that a new, rebooted Fantastic Four movie was in the works. The only things they lacked were a script, a cast, a director, and any sort of plan for what the hell they were supposed to do. Fortunately, they still had a few years to figure it out before their contract ran out again, so they put most of their resources into the X-Men movies in the meantime. But by 2012, with time running out, Fox finally decided we should probably get cracking on that Fantastic Four movie. And so the search began for a director to helm the project, the kind of guy that could deliver quickly and efficiently, working to a tight time limit. Enter Josh Trank, an up-and-coming talent whose success on the low-budget sci-fi movie Chronicle was enough to persuade the studio that he was the man for the job. Unfortunately, that's where the problems began. Trank's first act as director was to throw out all the scripts and ideas that were in development and lock himself away with screenwriter Jeremy Slater to develop a whole new film. Slater had just watched The Avengers and naturally wanted a film that was just as big, bright and action-packed. Trank, on the other hand, wanted a dark, moody character study centered around angst, alienation, and body horror. The two men couldn't agree on a course of action, and after 6 months of trying to get Trank interested in the source material, Slater eventually decided, fuck it, I'm out. Needless to say, Fox were starting to get a bit nervous by this point. Their deadline was looming and the project was going nowhere, so they brought in their own writers to hammer the script into something vaguely workable. They also sidelined Trank during this process, who was becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. Anyway, by early 2014, they finally had a workable script, even though none of them could agree on how the final act should play out, but I guess their assumption was, nah, it'll be fine. This version was darker, more serious and edgy than the previous Fantastic Four movies, not to mention anything in the MCU, and the studio made no secret about that in their advertising for the movie. Unfortunately, the fanbase weren't too happy, either with the dark and grim tone of the movie, or the fact that it was being made by Fox. After so many high-profile failures, they wanted the Fantastic Four to go back to Marvel where they belonged. Anyway, filming finally got underway in the summer of 2014, and pretty soon it became clear that Trank wasn't up to the task. It turns out that taking an inexperienced young director with one low-budget movie under his belt and throwing him into a major A-list production with an unfinished script and a tight deadline isn't exactly a recipe for success. Who knew? Trank frequently butted heads with the cast and crew, especially Kate Mara, who he reduced to tears on more than one occasion. Shit, sometimes he wouldn't even show up at all, forcing assistants to ghost direct entire scenes without him. Now, as you can imagine, the studio were getting pretty nervous when they started hearing reports of his behaviour on set, and their attempts to micromanage him only aggravated the situation further. The studio were by now desperate to remove him, and when they saw the first rough cut of the movie, they finally had the excuse they needed. Trank's take on the film was dark, grim and humourless, and even though that's exactly what they had agreed to before shooting began, they now decided they didn't like it. Bit fucking late for that kind of sentiment, guys. An even bigger problem was that the third act had never really been agreed on, and whatever Trank had been able to pull together wasn't enough to fill the gap. Either way, extensive reshoots were going to be needed to fix the movie. Reshoots that Trank absolutely wouldn't be part of. Unfortunately, these reshoots ended up being even more rushed and chaotic than principal photography, as that all-important deadline loomed. Scripts were rewritten and reworked on the fly, scenes were improvised just as they were being shot, and the whole ending of the movie was basically cobbled together from whatever crap they could find. Another problem was that Kate Mara had cut her hair short for another role, forcing the makeup department to fit her with the world's most obvious wig, and the general sentiment amongst the cast and crew was that nobody really wanted to be there anymore. Humiliated and embittered by his treatment, Trank disowned the movie and refused to promote it, even going so far as to publicly criticise his own film on social media before it released. It seemed like everybody hated this fucking movie, and pretty soon it was easy to see why. Fantastic Four was a disaster when it finally came out. Fans and critics alike finally found something they could agree on, and the movie ended up getting 9% on Rotten Tomatoes, failed to earn back anything near its production budget, and killed the prospect of any more Fantastic Four movies under Fox. Ironically enough though, the rights would finally revert back to Marvel after more than 30 years when the parent company Disney bought out Fox in 2019. You know, my research on production hell has taught me so many ways a movie can go wrong, but in the case of Fantastic Four, I don't think I've ever seen so many different factors combined together to derail one production. Most of the blame tends to fall on Josh Trank, and it's not hard to see why. In retrospect, he was clearly the wrong man for the job, lacking the experience, emotional maturity, and work ethic to take on a massive project like this. His behaviour on set didn't win him any fans, and I think it's pretty telling that no one on the cast or crew spoke up to defend him in the wake of his firing. The whole debacle basically derailed his career, and in the 6 years since this film came out, he's only directed one other movie. Now that's all fair enough, but I think the bulk of the responsibility should rest with the studio themselves. Young, inexperienced and unproven directors are not the kind of people you trust with $100 million movie, and they really should have known that. Not only did they hire an unknown talent like Trank, but they also approved of his creative vision, knowing full well that it was going to alienate a good chunk of the audience, only to reject it when that same vision was turned into a finished product. I don't know, man. It kind of feels like they set themselves up to fail on this one, and used Trank as a convenient scapegoat when they did. Ultimately, Fantastic Four feels like a project that was doomed from the start, born from the same anything to keep the rights from Marvel mentality that spawned the aborted 1990s film, thrown onto the shoulders of a man who absolutely wasn't up to the task, and released to an unenthusiastic fanbase who knew that Marvel could probably do it better. Pride really can be a costly thing, and never more so than when you choose to stake hundreds of millions of dollars on it. And if nothing else, I think Fantastic Four should serve as an example that, well, sometimes you just need to concede that you're not the right person for the job. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.